Hello, I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and welcome to Ask a Historian. Each week, we invite you to send in your questions, and we will explore the fascinating history of the City of Mississauga together. This episode takes place less than a week before Remembrance Day, and in these days of COVID, traditional remembrance services will look different this year. The City of Mississauga will be offering a virtual remembrance service at the Mississauga Civic Memorial, and other services, scaled down in nature, will take place in our city as well. For anyone participating, we wish you well. There are, of course, many ways to remember, from personal moments of reflection and thanks, to perhaps visiting a cenotaph on your own time to pay your respects. Personally, I'm always drawn to music and poetry at this time of year. From songs like A Pittance of Time by Terry Kelly and Highway of Heroes by the Trews, to poems such as Just a Common Soldier and, of course, In Flanders Fields. I would also urge those interested to support our local legions with the Poppy campaign. And please, even though things look different this year, I hope that we can all pause for 2 minutes at 11 a.m. on November 11th, regardless of where we are, to remember those that served and those that fell. We will remember them. Thank you, David, for your question on cenotaphs in Mississauga. And yes, indeed, there are many throughout the city, and most of them predate the City of Mississauga and are connected to some of the historic communities that now make up the City of Mississauga through that amalgamation process. Places like Port Credit and Streetsville and Malton and Dixie and Lakeview and Arundel all had their own forms of remembrance, of honoring those that had served and had not come home. There are many other markers. There's things like honor rolls and remembrances. Some congregations and church buildings and community groups have honorings, plaques, memorial windows, benches, and the like. All connecting to veterans who served and fell overseas. And so there are many forms of remembrance found throughout our city. There is no singular form that connects the entire city, at least in its original state, in terms of how communities remembered their war dead. There's not a singular one that identifies all of the City of Mississauga. There is now a civic memorial at Celebration Square at the City of Mississauga that is the centerpiece for the City of Mississauga's remembrance programs, but it's the newest member, if you will, of the community memorials. In terms of your question about the oldest one, the oldest cenotaph or war memorial in the City of Mississauga is the Port Credit and Vicinity Soldiers Memorial, the Port Credit and Vicinity Soldiers Memorial, as it was originally known, or as we refer to it today, the Port Credit War Memorial. And it was unveiled on November 9th of 1925. The second oldest one, less than a year after that, on July 1st, 1926, the Streetsville Cenotaph, or what was officially known as the Great War Overseas Veterans Memorial, was unveiled on July 1st of 1926. And we'll save the history, perhaps, of the Streetsville Cenotaph for another episode of Ask a Historian. In part because your question was specifically as to which was the oldest. So in regards to the Port Credit War Memorial, which again is our oldest cenotaph here in the City of Mississauga, its history dates back to a few years prior to when it was unveiled, and that was right at the cessation or the end of the First World War. In 1919, a Soldiers Memorial Committee was formed in part to welcome returning soldiers, but also to start investigating ways in which soldiers could be commemorated or remembered in the community. And it was in part organized through the Port Credit Village Council, but also in partnership with the St. Lawrence Starch Company and the Gray family. It was the original aspect was to determine a best way to commemorate the 30 or so young men who would not return home to Port Credit and the immediate surrounding area. The committee and the village council decided that a monument would be required, and it should be erected in the old village park on Brook Street. In 1944, Brook Street was renamed Stavebank Road. The Port Credit and Vicinity Soldiers Memorial is located on what was the site of the former town square or town park and a band shell. And during the course of the war, notices of the dead were posted on the band shell. So a place that was once connected to kind of music and gaiety, if you will, became a place of somber remembrance. And so from a location perspective, placing the memorial in this location made sense in the community. The band shell was relocated and made way for a space for the new Veterans Memorial or Soldiers Memorial to be erected. The first mention of raising funds to build this memorial in Port Credit came in April of 1924. And a year later, in 1925, a cenotaph design from the Macintosh Granite Company was accepted. The band shell was a site was selected for the Soldiers Memorial, and the memorial was unveiled on November 9th of 1925. The design of the Port Credit War Memorial is based on a symbol known as the Cross of Sacrifice. And it's an accepted cenotaph design by Sir Reginald Blomfield for the Imperial, now the Commonwealth, War Graves Commission in 1918. The memorial originally listed the names of 32 soldiers from Port Credit and the immediate surrounding area who fell in the First World War. In 1946 and in 1983, respectively, casualties from the Second World War and the Korean War were added. One of the neat things, a little bit more recently, the park in which the memorial sits today was not originally named. It wasn't until 2017 that the Council of the City of Mississauga formally named the park Vimy Park in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. For the story of Vimy Ridge and connecting to historic Mississauga, if we can do a leap from just memorial to the place in which it sits and where it gets its name from, amongst the thousands of Canadians that participated at the attack on Vimy Ridge in April of 1917 were more than 50 soldiers from historic Mississauga, including 7 who lost their lives. Those 7 were Private Dennis Anger of Arundel, Sergeant Thomas Cartwright of Arundel, Private Joseph Clark of Streetsville, Private William Kidd of Clarkson, Private Eli Rossiter of Clarkson, Private Jack Young of Clarkson, and Lieutenant James Fawcett of Streetsville. 11 others were from historic Mississauga were wounded at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So we have the Port Credit War Memorial dedicated to specifically in 1925 and commemorating kind of South Mississauga or Port Credit area soldiers that fell in the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War. Sitting in a park that is named for the broader Canadian involvement and local involvement at the Battle of Vimy Ridge on its 100th anniversary. Inscribed on the base of the War Memorial in Port Credit, let those who come after see to it that the names be not forgotten. And when you look at the names on the cenotaph, it's sometimes we forget the names have a deeper meaning within the community in which they appear. There are families connected to them at the time, and of course descendants of relatives perhaps that are still within the community, but each one of those names was a life lost in that community. Each one of those names was a young man who did not come home, young ladies who were left at home, left to mourn the passing of family, friends, loved ones, partners, etc., and really resonates within the community. So the Port Credit War Memorial is a focal point of remembrance services in the city of Mississauga, but it is not the only one. Streetsville has remembrance services, as does the Civic Square, as does the Cenotaph in Lakeview and Malton and so on. But Port Credit, again, an iconic symbol to sacrifice and remembrance in the city of Mississauga. Thank you for your question. Thank you, Jason, for your question here on Ask a Historian. And before I respond, thank you for your service. I note from your email that you yourself are a veteran. Branch 82 of the Royal Canadian Legion was initiated in Port Credit in 1926, when interested veterans from the First World War started to get together and meet with each other in their local homes. A charter was applied for, which was granted on April 10th of 1927, and Branch 82 was officially formed and named in honor of the late Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thompson of Port Credit. The first official meeting took place on July 28th of 1927 at Clark Memorial Hall in Port Credit, with the first president named Captain Eric Goodrum. Initial meetings were held at the Oddfellows Hall on Stavebank Road, and a few other homes, and also moving into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. By 1932, meetings were moved over to the Orange Lodge building, also on Stavebank Road. Sod was turned for their own building on December 20th of 1964, and this is at the present site and the first purpose-built home for the Legion in Port Credit, and the building was known as the Legion Memorial Hall, which opened its doors in 1966. In terms of who it's named for, the Legion itself, Alexander Thompson was born in Port Credit in 1888, the son of John Thompson of Thompson Lumber in Port Credit. Alexander Thompson enlisted as a lieutenant in the Canadian Expeditionary Force on September 17th of 1914, within the first month of the war, very early on. He was wounded in action in April of 1915, but returned to the front and earned promotions based on his strong leadership abilities. In 1916, he was promoted to captain and awarded the Military Cross, and that fall he became a major and received the Distinguished Service Order. At the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he acted as second in command of the 10th Battalion, and in June of 1917, he was given command of the 4th Canadian Infantry Battalion and was promoted to acting lieutenant colonel. His career, his path, if you will, through the First World War, as well as promotions, were remembered or were recognized in the local newspapers of the time. Kind of the poster child of local war recruitment and war involvement, kind of a favorite son of the south end of Peel County. Lieutenant Colonel sadly was killed. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was sadly killed by a sniper at the Battle of Passchendaele on November 19th of 1917. And it was written in the Streets Review of him at the time of his death that no braver soldier, no finer man than Alex Thompson crossed over the ocean since the war began. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson is buried at Écouves Military Cemetery in Pas-de-Calais, France, and he is remembered on the Port Credit War Memorial, and of course the Legion in Port Credit is named in his honor. The youngest lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Army at the time of his death, and the highest ranking officer from historic Mississauga to lose his life in the First World War. We remember him. Thank you, Amber, for your question, and it certainly sounds like your son has an interesting topic to delve into in terms of local history. And in short, yes, many local factories and companies redirected their production efforts into wartime production, including companies like the St. Lawrence Starch Factory in Port Credit. But to draw on a singular example, you mentioned Small Arms Limited and the munitions factory in Lakeview. But there was another one that equally as large in terms of just workforce, but not nearly as well known as Small Arms Limited was, and probably a reason why is there's very little evidence left of their existence on the modern landscape. But probably the best other example of large-scale wartime industry manufacturing in historic Mississauga was that of Victory Aircraft in Malton. At its height, Victory employed more than 9,000 workers, around half of which were women. Victory Aircraft Limited was a Canadian manufacturing company that during the Second World War built under license mainly British-designed aircraft. It acted at what was known as a shadow factory, safe from the reach of German bombers, in partnership with British manufacturers at the time. Initially, major wartime contracts for the manufacture of airframes or aircraft, and particularly that of the Avro Lancaster heavy bomber, were given to National Steel Car Limited, which was headquartered in Hamilton and utilized the Malton, Ontario aircraft factory. National Steel Car was already producing the Westland Lysander aircraft, and it was involved as a subcontractor with the Hawker Hurricane fighter planes, Avro Anson trainers, and the Handley Page Hampton bombers. However, questions arose about the company's ability to manage the massive project that would be involved with production of Lancaster bombers. J.P. Bickle, one of C.D. Howe's dollar-a-year men, he advocated for the nationalization of National Steel Car Company. And in November of 1942, a Crown Corporation was set up, which was become known as Victory Aircraft Limited, and was incorporated under the Department of Munitions and Supplies. Although the kind of at its outset, they already had existing contracts with the anticipation of the contract for the Lancaster bomber to arrive. The contract was received to participate in this wartime production back in 1941. First drawings arrived in Canada for the Lancaster bomber in January of 1942. But it was a massive undertaking, a very complex project at the time. Some 500,000 manufacturing operations were involved, manufacturing over 55,000 separate component parts that went into the Lancaster bomber. It was an enormous undertaking. One of the fascinating things about the aircraft, which were incredibly successful, were that the British and Canadian Lancasters, the parts were largely interchangeable, which meant when an aircraft were overseas and they were damaged, parts were readily available. So the blueprints for the aircraft again arrived in 1942. There was an aircraft that was flown from Britain to act as the prototype, if you will, or the drawing board to compare the Canadian-built Lancasters against one that has already been built as a pattern aircraft, between 1942 and 1944, the workforce at Victory Aircraft increased from 3,300 employees up to 9,521 employees by 1944. Most of them were initially unskilled workers, and half of them were women. Exactly a year from the date when the pattern aircraft was flown to Canada, the first Canadian prototype Lancaster, known as KB700 or the Ruhr Express, rolled off the assembly line on August 1st of 1943. There was a great deal of publicity around the rollout of this aircraft. Eventually, Lancaster production at Victory Aircraft reached the impressive mark of one aircraft per day under the direction of General Manager David Boyd, and that one aircraft per day was reached in November of 1944. Victory Aircraft employees, one of the neat things about the employees was the kind of the progressive nature of the company itself. Not only did they have a large number of their workforce were women, but they also had employees of ethnic minorities as well. Several images of black employees have come forward over time as well. Victory Aircraft had many tax benefits and services, food services, medical expenses, subsidized housing and transportation, a pay-per-performance program, an hourly pay for hourly paid employees, and a reduction of the work week from 55.5 hours to 48 hours as the work week itself. Ultimately, Victory Aircraft produced 430 Lancaster heavy bombers between 1943 and 1945. It was an amazing look at kind of Canadian contribution to the larger war effort overseas. The Lancasters played a pivotal role in the bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, and again, 430 of them were made right here in Malton, in Mississauga, between 1943 and 1945. So this week, joining us for Ask a Historian once again is Elizabeth Underhill, Supervisor of Museums and Education for the Museums of Mississauga. There's an exciting program going on, and we highlighted it earlier in another episode in September on Ask a Historian, but two simultaneous exhibits happening, as well as a speaker series associated with them. That is Our Boys, an exhibit highlighting First World War fallen soldiers from historic Mississauga, and War Flowers, which is a traveling exhibit that's been brought in and is at the Living Arts Center. So we'll revisit those, and then we'll talk a little bit about the speaker series. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us again.
My pleasure.
I'm glad to have you. So our boys, just in brief, and when we're done, we'll run the links because there is online registration for this. But Our Boys is running at the Anchorage and at Benares Visitor Center as well.
Yep, it's at Bradley Museum and at Benares. So both.
And what's how's the reaction been? It's been running now for about a month and a half, something like that.
Oh yeah, close to, well, more like 2 months. It opened right at the start of September.
Yep.
So yeah, it's been 2 months now. It's been open. It's I think people are grateful to be able to see this part of Mississauga's history and the stories of the young men from historic Mississauga who went overseas and saw combat in World War I and were killed in action. It's, I mean, if I can toot our own horns a little bit, it's a beautifully designed exhibition. There's a lot of information to go through and a lot of really interesting photographs of these soldiers and Canadians in combat overseas. That they're photos you don't really get to see too much. You actually get to see some of the faces of these boys who died for our country. So it's pretty interesting.
And very telling. I mean, I remember touching on this in September when we first spoke about it, but here we are a week away from Remembrance Day, and Remembrance Day is going to look a little different this year. I know City Hall is doing a virtual remembrance at the Civic Memorial, but people might be looking for other ways to remember those that served and fell. And here is a prime example where you can book a tour online and come pay your respects in a different format than sometimes we normally do. But I do think it's beautiful. So kudos. I haven't seen it yet in person myself. I've seen the artwork, and the artwork is stunning. And so kudos to your team for taking really rough information and making it so compelling to engage with.
Yeah, and it's there are a lot of panels with the information about the fallen soldiers, but we also tell stories of other people who made very important contributions in the First World War as well. So the Women's Institute that was here in Clarkson and Lorne Park, we talk about the work that they did organizing fundraisers and creating comfort boxes to send overseas. And kind of hand making the bandages, and there's some surprising information in there that people may not know about the First World War, why were soldiers being sent women's pantyhose, for example. So I'm going to leave that as a question. People will have to come to the exhibit to find out.
Always wonderful to hang a hanging one to actually have people go and try to solve it themselves.
Yeah, like what would that be used for? So, and we also talk about contributions of other Canadians and Indigenous veterans that sometimes get overlooked when we're remembering the First World War.
Absolutely.
So for, everyone, to our knowledge, from your research, Matthew, all of the fallen from Mississauga were white, and that's just what Mississauga looked like at that time. There's one individual who has some African ancestry, but also looked white. So we just wanted to make sure to share the stories of the other Canadians who were instrumental in fighting and winning this war, who we don't talk about from the Mississauga side of things, but they still played an important role. So we worked with the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada to find out information about, well, what was the role of Sikh soldiers in World War One from Canada, but also from the British Empire, from India, and we look at the Indigenous contributions. So we worked a little bit with Darren Waibenga from the Mississaugas of the Credit to highlight some information about the contributions and the fallen Indigenous veterans. And we also worked with Natasha Henry, who is the president of the Ontario Black History Society, to learn more about Black Canadians who were involved in the First World War. So it's really a lovely recognition and paying respects of all the people who were part of this fight.
And we'll use that as a segue, because I want to speak to you about the presentations coming up. But before I lose a thought, there's one thing that I've been percolating back in my mind, and for those that do research, and one of the reasons why sometimes we generally do not have all the information that we would wish to have, is that private record material is sealed for 90 years after creation, and so we have access right now, generally speaking, from 1921 up to 1921, and so anything after 1921, it's not necessarily available in the amount that we have prior to that. So where I'm getting with that is, for those that fell in the First World War, their lives end prior to 1918. Therefore, all their information is public. But those that survived and past 1921, that information is still not really available, particularly the life story material. And so as we move forward in time, that material will percolate and come to the fore as we progress in time. But where I'm getting with that in a roundabout way is your reference to, you're right, of the 96 documented fallen, certainly 95 of them are white Caucasian soldiers from historic Mississauga. The average in the Canadian service is 1 in 10 soldiers were casualties. So if we do our numbers of 96 fallen, that means on the national average, we'd have close to 1,000 soldiers who enlisted for service. That 1,000 number, whatever that number actually is, we don't entirely know. But as time progresses, we should find out more. That should have a better look at the population as a whole, and you certainly hope that as we evolve, that we'll be able to uncover those stories of different peoples who were engaged in the war. So I would hope, whether it's us or somebody else, that 20 years from now, when we revisit this subject,
Exactly.
we'll have greater stories and greater connections to make, and a greater understanding of what our community contributions were. So I hope that comes. We explore more past in the future. Does that make sense? But using what you said for a segue to talk about the presentations coming up, because there's a number of them, and I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of highlight each of them and let people know how they can engage in these conversations that the museums are having. And is there a title for the program itself? Just online conversations? I've got.
We're just calling it a online speakers series, and it's happening in conjunction with both Warflowers and the Our Boys exhibitions. So the material is definitely relevant to both exhibitions and is meant to sort of enrich the exhibits that we have on. Yeah.
And we'll put up, so people aren't jotting things down as we're writing here, we'll throw some dates out, but at the end of the program, we'll actually put a list of all the dates and times coming up. But the first one on the list, after this program runs the very next day, November 6th, is Lawrence Hill in conversation with Natasha Henry, and that's
Mhm.
Friday, November 6th at 7 p.m.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what they will be?
Yeah. So we are so thrilled to have Lawrence Hill and Natasha Henry together in conversation. We're presenting this in partnership with the Mississauga Library. And Lawrence is a notable, amazing, highly awarded Canadian author. Um, and his father actually was one of the founders of the Ontario Black History Society. So it's a very nice convergence with him and Natasha. And he, as we know, is the author of the Book of Negroes, as well as many other important pieces of fiction and nonfiction work. So he's working right now on investigating the story of African American soldiers in World War II who were in Canada working on the construction of the Alaska Highway. Um, and so if the opportunity came up to talk about these sort of little known or non-mainstream stories about our history, when we brought on the Warflowers exhibition and Our Boys, and we realized, oh, we're not telling everybody's story. So where can we create space to capture this history as well? So that was kind of the starting point. Was Lawrence would share a little bit about his research and also about the research behind the Book of Negroes that he did and the slave trade that happened and what enslaved people's lives in Canada looked like that we don't really tend to talk about or know that much about. And Natasha will tie that to her own research. She's currently completing her PhD at York University. And she's very interested in the story of enslaved Africans in early Canada, and as well as how did African people kind of spread out across Canada? Why did they choose to migrate where they did and settle down where they did? And why is it that we don't have more information about this history in our country? So I think it's going to be a really fascinating and illuminating conversation. As of the time of our conversation, Matthew, we have over 600 people registered for it,
Oh, wow.
which is amazing.
That's awesome.
So there's still room to register for it for sure. That's one of the benefits of doing this all online,
Yeah.
and it will be recorded. So if people can't make it for the live talk, it will be recorded and put on our website.
You realize that's more people than we have space in the lecture hall to do in
Exactly.
Mississauga. So that's phenomenal. I'm looking forward to it because that is certainly an unknown and not obscure, but a relatively unexplored topic.
Yeah,
Not only locally, of course, we're focused, locally, but in the Canadian story. We aren't Mississauga story is not independent from the rest of Canada in the broader perspective, but
that's right.
in sometimes in looking at the larger picture, you can uncover the local stories, and so hopefully this
Yeah,
is an avenue to do that, and not only with exciting to have Lawrence and Natasha. But not only with them, but you look at your other topics coming up as well. The same potential maybe
yeah,
there to
I think
to
so.
to uncover those. So Lawrence Hill and Natasha Henry. That's Friday, November 6th.
Yeah.
Following that is Thursday, November 12th, is Anthony Sherwood on Honor Before Glory in partnership with PAMA.
Hmm.
And what can people expect there with Anthony's presentation?
Yeah, so Anthony is an amazing actor and filmmaker, and he created this film, Honor Before Glory, about Canada's first all-Black battalion that was raised for the First World War, and it was the number 2 construction battalion based out of Nova Scotia. And so he created a film about this, and he will be talking about the film itself. Pama is we're not showing the film, but I think the conversation will be very illuminating as well, because it will really highlight the racism and the barriers that Black Canadians face when they were trying to, exercise their right to enlist and serve Canada in World War One. There was so much call for people to enlist and do the right thing and do their duty to king and country. And Black volunteers were showing up at enlistment offices trying to join up, and they were being turned away and told this is a white man's war. So through a lot of community lobbying, some very important Black Canadians helped to bring attention to this issue that Black volunteers were continued to be turned away by the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So what the government did was they created a labor battalion and said, okay, well, we don't think that white soldiers are going to enjoy having Black soldiers among them and fighting alongside them. So you can do the labor, the digging the trenches, cutting down trees, things like that. So it's not happy, right? It's not
Not
nice.
a happy story.
But it's what happened. And there were Black Canadians who were able to enlist and see combat and played very important roles. But it's really interesting part of our history that is not really, that mainstream subject that you get in your classes in school. So.
Well, and part of this is, I think, our duty and as educators in this world to try to make the story a truthful story that connects with people of today's generation, to make it their story. And unfortunately, exclusionary practices were part of our collective histories, but there were ways in which people found a way to contribute, almost against the system, if you will. But the system evolved too, and that was largely driven out of the need for soldiers as the war progressed, and so that they had to broaden their perspectives because they needed the manpower. But we talked about earlier the lack of, minority groups represented in our fallen here at Historic Mississauga, and how much of that might have been an outcome of an exclusionary recruitment policy. So again, maybe it doesn't reflect society, right? So that future history as we explore this. But again, these are conversations I think are important, and who knows what conversations they generate. In terms, again, maybe it's not on our shoulders, but maybe it's the next generation that begins to uncover some of these stories. And it's good to have the conversations. I think I know Second World War is a little different. Maybe that's an example of an evolving concept of people and value, but it's still not without its prejudices. It's still not it's almost baby steps. And you look at the world today, we're not there yet.
But we're not. No.
How far have we come, and how far do we have to go? And I'm not a good prognosticator, but we can look back and see these linear things. I think history gives us that perspective. We can see the timelines. Yeah. We can see the slow evolution, the slow march, if you will. And we have to tell those stories because they're not all rosy ones. But kudos to you for exploring them. It's easier to not touch on the difficult subjects sometimes, and you're not shying away from it. So I'm encouraged by that.
Well, these people who are doing the talks, like Anthony Sherwood, Lawrence Hill, Natasha Henry, and our other speakers, I mean, they're amazing, and it's hard not to want to invite them on to tell these stories. Absolutely. Because they're just so knowledgeable, and I'm very curious, and just I crave and hunger new information all the time. So
you're a sponge in the background.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
maybe this opens up new avenues for future exhibits and future educational programs. That's exciting. That's really exciting. So from there we go to Darren Wybenga on Veterans of the Mississaugas and New Credit. That's Saturday, November 14th at 7 p.m.
Yeah.
Do you know what Darren's going to be touching on?
Yeah. So Darren is going to be sharing stories of a few of the veterans from the Mississaugas who may not be so well known. again. One is, oh, let me just open this. My apologies.
No worries.
I got too excited and I lost my train of thought here. There is one soldier in particular from the Mississaugas. He's a descendant of Joseph Brant. His name is Cameron Brant, and he was, unfortunately, he was killed in the First World War. But the Mississaugas recently received a book of poetry that he purchased while he was overseas. I believe it's called Songs of Sourdough. And his name is signed in it. So again, it's kind of like that detective work of going back through those records, finding little tidbits and artifacts like this, and kind of connecting the dots to put together a full picture of who was this person, why did he enlist, where was he enlisting, and what did he do while he was overseas. So, I think of the film 1917, and there's a man in that film who's wearing a turban, and I remember that there was some outcry over that of like, well, what's this whole, why are you including someone with a turban in this? Like, this diversity and inclusion thing has gone too far. And it's like, no, because there were actually Sikh soldiers who wore turbans who were there overseas, and there were First Nations and Métis and possibly some Inuit as well in Newfoundland's forces who went overseas and saw combat. So I think those are the stories that get left behind, and Darren's going to come in and he's going to share what he knows about the Mississaugas and how they got involved, and just, represent and bring more visibility to those people who nowadays you may look at it and go, that seems out of place, but no, it's a fact. Like, there were so many people of color, Indigenous people, Black people who did go and serve.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm pretty excited for Darren's talk. He's a great storyteller and amazing historian. So
and we have him on next week's episode of Ask a Historian as well on November 12th, kind of highlighting some of the stories. I promise he's not going to give too much away for the presentation on the 14th, but again, a great storyteller, and it's to hear stories of a community that are so deeply personal really help bring the story home, and you get that impression when you speak with Darren that this is and perhaps the others as well, that this means something deeply to them, and I think that's really a neat way to touch on the subject of remembrance and service and
and recognition and paying our respects, because I think maybe the average Canadian isn't aware of just how much Indigenous people have contributed to Canada, even going back to the War of 1812. Would we even be here today if we didn't have Indigenous allies fighting with the British? So really important to recognize that and how significant Indigenous involvement in war efforts has been. So,
someone once told me, an old university professor of mine, and it's one of those things that stick in the back of my head. And I know if we're going to go on a little bit when we first met, we did a tour around the city, and I remember just talking about this evolution of thought that we were in through. You can call it reconciliation, you can call it conversations of understanding, of trying to see the path forward as a community. And of course, we're seeing it during these days of COVID, of civil unrest, particularly south of the border. But this ideas of percolating that enough is enough, and how do we move forward from here. But where I was going with that was I was once told that when we study history, when we talk history, it is never too late to say thank you or I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Never. Absolutely. And even if it's generations later, it is never too late. Those kind of statements of thank yous and sorries are not necessarily an ending of a conversation. Sometimes they're beginning of a conversation. So hopefully it's something that these engender. I think this is a neat thing. I'm curious to see what comes out of this from a moving forward programming perspective. But from there, maybe we'll go quickly over the last two, but we've got November 18th. We have Pardeeps sing Anagra on Brothers in Arms, the Sikhs in World War I. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but
Yeah.
you highlight a little bit of what Pardeep is going to speak about.
Yeah, so Pardeep's talk, I think, again, is going to blow everyone out of the water. We were able to borrow a few artifacts from him from the Sikh Museum. So we do have a dead man's penny on display from one of the Sikhs who fought. We have some insignia and war medals from the 14th Regiment in the British Indian Army. Um, so that's kind of amazing to see these pieces. And we have some little toy soldiers of Sikhs wearing turbans as part of their formal military dress. So Pardeep's a very amazing storyteller. I feel like I keep gushing, but he really helps to bring awareness to the contributions of Sikhs. And of all of the British Empire's armies, it was the British Indian Army that was in France, in Flanders, before anyone else, before Canada, New Zealand, etc. So, and Sikh soldiers in particular were very highly regarded as these incredible warriors who were fully prepared for battle and had amazing military strategy and skills, and were fully equipped even. So he's going to share some very interesting little pieces of that printed matter, like postcards and newspaper articles from the time, that are really just celebrating and so happy and thrilled to have Sikh soldiers in this effort as part of the British Empire. And it's really interesting. There's a photo of King George actually wearing a turban.
Really? Oh, okay.
As the Emperor of India. So it really is a stark contrast of stories that we are told in our society today of like, well, what are, these people from India or these Sikh people, like, what have they ever done for Canada? Are they like just freeloaders, all these immigrants coming over? And it's like, Sikhs and Indian soldiers were in Flanders. They were there first. There's a lot of contribution to Canada and the British Empire thanks to the British Indian Army. So, and he'll bring kind of like the evidence of that, all the postcards that were created to say like, yeah, they were, very highly regarded. So
I'm very much looking forward to his talk because I know from past experience, Pardeep is his enthusiasm is infectious. And,
exactly.
I remember in one comment, and this is, we often, to parallel what you were saying, we don't often think in terms of parallels between Canadians and Sikhs in war. One of the parallels that has come across in historiography is when the German army faced either a Canadian or Sikh army, they knew that they were in for a fight that was not going to be given easily. And so these were the colonies, but they were well prepared to do their all as to advance or to achieve whatever aim that they were given. And the last one is me. Yeah, on November 24th at 7 p.m. and I can't believe we're already in November talking about this, but it's we're focusing on presentation on Our Boys on the fallen of historic Mississauga, and highlighting or connecting really to the theme of the bulk of the exhibit, and that is the soldiers from this community. And I don't know, you want to talk about me, or is that enough of
what can I say? Well, why don't you talk about you, Matthew?
Well, I think, you know what, I almost want to leave it hanging there in a sense that, come and see the exhibit. This is, November 24th when we do this one, is going to wrap it up and bring it home into the boys from this community. And there are some stories in that community that tug on my heartstrings. And, we're going to highlight a few of the stories. We're going to highlight the timeline of Mississauga's involvement in the war, the boys that went overseas. The title of Our Boys is really a powerful one in my view, because they are the in the Second World War, we have women fallen as well, but in the First World War, they were all the young boys of the community that went overseas. The national average of fallen was 1 in 10. Port Credit's fallen was 1 in 8. And so you look at the stories of the fallen, the stories of how they affect the community, we aren't a major city at that point. We're a collection of small towns, and people knew people. If you weren't directly affected, you knew somebody who was. The average age of our fallen, 96 fallen in the First World War, the average age is 23 years of age. Almost 80 of them were unmarried with no children. Only a handful of them had children. So, I mean, these are ends of stories. These are, you can ask a lot of what ifs. We'll tell the story of Alexander Thompson, who the Port Credit Legion is named for. One of his epitaphs that was written after his death in the Streets of Review said, "No finer son of Peel County existed." What could this person have achieved in his lifetime? What contributions would he have made to this thing called became Mississauga? We don't know. Those stories end, and there's heartbreak in there. But it's well worth remembering. When we stand, speaking for myself, when I stand before a cenotaph on Remembrance Day, again a little different this year, but those are the stories that I think of, are the people who did not come home, and were mourned by those who lived in this place. They didn't know Mississauga by name. But they walked on Lakeshore Road. They lived on Front Street. They shopped in stores that still exist in Streetsville. They lived here. This was their home, and many of them did not come home. And so I think that's, maybe we'll leave it on that. It's powerful to remember. And there was a statement some years ago. Maybe this applies to the whole of the theme of all these talks, but William Hamilton Merritt rose on the podium at the unveiling of Brock's Monument, the second monument at Queenston Heights.
Yeah.
Let this moment not be lost on the rising generation, were his opening words. I would say collectively, as Canadians, we have often lost that moment on the rising generation, and it's beholden to us, I think, to remember those that stood up and served. And I think it tugs on the heartstrings a bit, and I think it should. And it can make us uncomfortable, and I think it should. But there's good stories too. Like, it's not just, and we should remember those, and they are powerful. And maybe we can end on, segueing. We've talked about our boys, the exhibit, the presentations that are coming up, and again, we'll run the link to these. But Warflowers as well tell stories that tug at the heartstrings. And our Warflowers ends December. I got it here. December 13th coming up, and that's at the Living Arts Center. And I don't know if you want to talk maybe a minute on that,
yeah. So.
See.
Warflowers is really beautiful now that it's here and it's installed, and I've been able to walk through it. It's a really unique experience and very emotional again. The curator, Viveka Melki, is a filmmaker by trade, so she said her job is to try to evoke emotions and evoke like feelings and that kind of a response in viewers. So you go through and you have music, you have scents, there's perfume that you can actually like press a button and smell. It's all safe for COVID. And you get to see footage of World War I, and you get to see you get to read little snippets about 10 Canadians who were from Montreal. So the exhibition originated at Reeford Gardens, which is in Quebec. So that's kind of what links those 10 Canadians together. They're all from Montreal. And there's a little bit of information about each one, and it's kind of about that moment of vulnerability while they were making their contribution to the First World War, where their life kind of changed forever and no longer looked the way it once did. So there's some very interesting archival photographs that we, again, don't get to see very often. They've gone ahead and they've created they've recorded all the names of those who died in the First World War, either as a result of combat or illness during their time in that war. And oh gosh, I think it's over 66,000 names. And they said that's the first time that all those names have been put together in one place. You can come in and you can see all these names, and it's just, yeah, and it's at the Living Arts Center, and there's a beautiful stained glass installation behind it. So there's kind of this like cathedral, almost otherworldly element to the experience.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. I hope people can get out to see it because, again, very powerful to have here in Mississauga. And kudos to the museum and the museum team for bringing it here. The days of COVID have presented some challenges, but we march forward, and hopefully people are able to come out and see these things in our community. So, with that, Elizabeth, thank you very much again. And maybe we'll be back on. We'll have you on for Christmas time.
Sure, why not?
Give you a break for a little bit. But thank you very much, and be well, and best of luck with the exhibits and with the upcoming speaker series, and really looking forward to sitting back and learning and listening myself, and looking forward to hearing these conversations and seeing where it takes us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.